Okay.
Dear Massimo, we are witnessing the biggest crisis, the worst crisis since the Second World War in Eastern Europe, when Russia invaded Ukraine. What do you think about the root cause of Russian invasion on Ukraine? We know very well that lots of pundits and scholars in the West warned the US policymakers, decision makers, that NATO enlargement will cause the Russian invasion. It will trigger the Russian reaction. After 3 months, can you summarize the conflict in Ukraine?
Yeah, so you're completely right in terms of your opening statements, because not only this is the largest conflict in Eastern Europe since World War II, I would say it is the most important conflict period in history after World War II, because the first time that indeed a major power is seriously involved with the potential, if not direct, already indirect engagement of another major power, right? So it's not that the US and NATO are putting boots on the ground in Ukraine, but are doing anything else that you can do, right? So basically, it's already an indirect confrontation between Russia and NATO / the US, and that's something we haven't seen for the past 70 plus years, 72 years. So that should spell the beginning of a different era than the one we have known thus far in world politics. We will be witnessing rearrangements of world politics that the Russian crisis, the Ukraine crisis triggered, but it was already in the making, in my opinion, for a few years. Why was it in the making? So to my mind, in my view, it is indeed the case that Russia perceives its neighborhood as a threatening one. Russia has an existential crisis at hand in its view, because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the borders were redefined, and these borders cannot guarantee the security of Moscow and the core Russian territory the way that USSR borders could. Not only USSR, but USSR influence, sphere of influence reached Berlin, right? Reached actually central Germany, basically, right? So now the borders moved from West Berlin, East Berlin, all the way to a couple of 100 kilometers from Moscow. And for Russia, this is like, we cannot, live with this current assessment. We just can't. People might say, well, but nobody has the intention of invading Russia. And maybe, but nobody can predict the future. And, policymakers do not make assumptions about what is going on nowadays, but what may happen in the future, right? So to my mind, the assessment, the purely strategic assessment of the Russian leadership was correct. These are not borders you can defend. Now, the other side of the story is the NATO expansion. And I do not know exactly how to frame this, because in my view as well, countries that became part of NATO after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, of the socialist, Eastern European bloc, were not forced necessarily to join NATO, in my view. Nobody put a gun at their heads and say, you must join. And the same did not happen with Finland and Sweden that, filed their application to join just a few days ago. It is a simple matter of strategic calculations on the part of these countries. If you have two powers, the United States on the one hand and Russia on the other, you will seek the protection of the one who's further away from you to protect you from the one is near to you. And therefore, it doesn't matter that the United States wanted or didn't want to have these countries under their protection. These countries sought after the protection of the United States simply because the United States are more efficient in protecting countries, and they are further away One day the United States will not be in Europe anymore. Russia will always be in Europe. And that's a very basic geopolitical calculations that these countries have done. Now, if you look at this from the point of view of Moscow, you're like, okay, these borders are not defensible, that they cannot be defended. And that's why they started the war in Ukraine. Now, if I may build briefly on that, Saib,
Please.
what is the overall calculation? Please.
Yeah, go ahead.
What is the overall calculation in terms of borders we need to ask ourselves, okay, if the current borders of the Russian Federations in the West cannot be defended, where can they be defended? Now, one consideration to start, and then the answer to this question. One is that Russian geography sucks. There is not a way to put it. Unlike the United States that have unthreatening neighbors to the north and unthreatening neighbors to the south, Canada and Mexico, and two huge oceans at their side, which is it's a paradise situation for any power, right? To have. Russia shares borders, I think, with 14 other countries. It has basically no easy access to any relevant body of water, right? The Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, they are enclosed seas. The Arctic is frozen basically 10 months a year, and the Pacific Ocean opens on nothing. So Russia has a terrible geography. And even more important, the relevant core of the Russian population, which sits in the western part of the country, basically along the St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kazan, Volga area, basically. It's completely open to the west, to this incredibly flat land that reaches all the way to Paris. And you don't need to be an expert on European history to know that Sweden, France, and Germany twice invaded Russia using this very corridor that stretches from the Central European plains all the way to the core of Russian population. So what do you need to do if you are Russia to secure your western borders? You have to reach a point where these vast expanses of flat land narrows as much as possible, so you can actually pitch and place their soldiers and troops to defend more efficiently and more easily access to your core territory. And yes, if our listeners want to pick up a map of Europe, that means basically to restore somewhat where the Soviet Union lay before its collapse, which means all the way to the Carpathian Range. Which means technically that if my calculation is correct, the Donbas, Crimea, annexation would be the first step towards a further push west to close the gaps in the current area around Odessa and the Bessarabian region between, basically the Danube Delta and Moldova, where the Carpathian Range begins. Take all that arc of mountains all the way up to southern Poland and push to have basically their corridor in the north, not as wide as it is now, 2,000 miles, 3,000 kilometers, but perhaps 300 kilometers. And if the Russians manage to reach all the way into the territory, that's when they feel secure. Now, of course, if you are a Polish, if you're a Pole, if you're a Ukrainian, if you're a Romanian, if you're a Slovak, yeah, you don't like that. Absolutely not. And not fun. But that's where, the strategic calculation of the Russian leadership is looking at. Yeah.
We have to remind our viewers that Eastern Galicia, which is now in Ukraine, used to be part of Poland for centuries. Poland moved 300, 400 kilometers westward when Germany was defeated after Second World War. So as a compensation for losing territories to Soviet Union, like cities like Lvov and Bessarabian area, they got Wrocław, Poznań, and Gdańsk. from Germany. And historically speaking, the territory of modern Belarus and Ukraine was changing hands multiple times. So things are not simple in that region. In my opinion, it was a matter of time when Russia will strike back. USSR was defensive, and eventually they collapsed 32 years ago, 31 years ago.
Yeah.
And since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the first calculation in geopolitical circles was what will happen between Ukraine and Russia in the future. And everyone predicted the war between Ukraine and Russia back in 90s, before the enlargement of NATO and before all countries that in the past formed the Eastern Bloc or were part of the Soviet Union joined the NATO. So we don't have a corridor of neutral states between NATO and the Russia, and this is the problem.
It is a problem, Saad, because, and I mean, we're talking about these issues, of course, without delving so much into the preferences of the people involved, but, you know, from a purely geostrategic point of view, whenever two powers share a border, that's a recipe for problems, if not more, right? And indeed, the whole notion of a buffer state is try to prevent all those problems from emerging. It's the reason why Mongolia is situated between you know, Russia and China, to provide some buffer. Nepal and Bhutan between India and China, right? It's a basic feature of our political geography, if you will. And even more so in terms of, you know, your historical remarks, because I really appreciate, you know, delving a little bit into history to understand what kind of lands we're talking about. If we take a historical map of the regions in Eastern Europe, no other borders in Europe have changed so much as the ones of Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, all the former lands of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And I remember the other day,
Lithuania changed its territory multiple times.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So
absolutely,
the borders of modern Ukraine are not something that existed for centuries. It's a state created by different territorial gains in recent history. And also I would like to mention one thing. Ukraine is not a neutral, peace-loving country.
Absolutely, the current borders.
Because lots of people forget that the third biggest contingent in Iraqi war or in Iraqi occupation after Second Gulf War came from Ukraine. Between 2003 and 2008, they sent 5,000 officers and soldiers to Iraq to be part of the so-called coalition of brave or coalition of willings. They have two terms for the same coalition. And recently I even discussed a tennis and sports boycott of Russian athletes with a political scientist from Australia, and he has all kinds of excuses for Australian involvement in the occupation of Iraq as a part of the coalition of willing. So lots of people overlook the fact that Ukraine was very active in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and also they forget that Ukrainian army has the largest military in Europe in terms of numbers. I'm talking about standing army. Ukrainian standing army is as big as German, UK, and French armies put together without the reserve troops. Altogether, they count around 600,000 people.
You know, look, I'm not an expert on military, you know, strategies, so to speak. Of course, you know, if I want to go back to your remarks about why Ukraine joined, for example, the coalition of the willing or coalition of the brave in Iraq, well, it's simply because, you know, a lot of other countries made the same calculation to ingratiate the United States it was the same, kind of move that I mentioned before, i.e., the Ukrainian government perceived an alliance or protection of the United States as functional towards keeping at bay Russia on the one hand. So if you could show your willingness to help the United States, maybe that is an investment in the long term to receive American help. And actually, from a purely strategic point of view, that kind of worked out, because now the United States is, helping logistically, material-wise, training-wise, the Ukrainian army. It is indeed, quite a turnaround for the Ukrainian army. If we think back what happened in 2014, right, when Russia basically took over Crimea without violence. Basically, they just engineered a referendum. They just took over the peninsula, and then they started, encroaching upon the Donbas basin, right, already in 2014.
Of course.
And at that time, the Ukrainian army, as big as it is in sheer numbers, as you suggested, didn't oppose any real, resistance to the Russians. After that, it is understood that probably Western countries started a massive training and replenishment of Ukrainian military capabilities over the last 8 years. And the difficulties of the Russian army to penetrate and to actually win, easily this war as it was projected may stem from that, i.e. the Ukrainian army of 2014 is a different entity. Yeah. From 8 years on, the Ukrainians basically trained to be able to resist, and they're doing what they can in terms of.
Very well. They're doing very well.
Yeah.
They're well equipped. They received the NATO equipment and NATO logistics from 2014 till now.
Yeah.
And I think this war may prolong for a couple of decades if neither side has a decisive victory. This is my opinion about that. What do you think about possible scenarios? Because I don't want to talk about one scenario. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
Please.
So I think you stand correct in terms. I mean, I agree with you. Maybe I do not put a number. I don't know if it is 2 years or 2 decades, but definitely it's not 2 months. It's not going to be resolved in July. This thing
or August.
Yeah. The Ukrainians have enough resources to basically keep fighting the Russians, but they don't have the possibility to defeat the Russians in any meaningful fashion. And the Russians have always the perspective of possibly winning the war, and they may actually win the war. And if that happens anyway, it will happen not again next July. It will be a conflict that will drag on for many years. And as I hinted at first, this may be the first step in a larger Eastern European conflict. And when that scenario is contemplated, then you are hardly thinking just about an Eastern European conflict, because it's impossible not to see other theaters. For example, the Baltic republics getting involved in somewhat. What about Finland and Sweden, who just joined NATO? And Finland, let's remember, used to be part of the Tsarist Empire.
Yeah,
shares a 1,300 kilometers border with Russia. The two countries have, have had an understanding about how to live next to one another for the past 70 years, but now that understanding has been altered. So all sorts of considerations may be on the table, because of all the states that I've mentioned, only Ukraine is not a formal member of NATO. All the others are. So the notorious or famous Article 5 that says that once you attack Lithuania, it's like attacking the United States itself. All bets are on the table. One thing that I would like to point out here is, a consideration of the economic aspects of this conflict, especially when it pertains to the economic sanctions that the West has imposed upon Russia. And I have two considerations on this. One is that, yes, these sanctions are probably the most thorough, comprehensive, and severe ever imposed on a country, probably. That really cripples the capacity of Russia to, how can I say, to maintain a vibrant, high-tech, developing economy. However, it does not impact the real capacity of Russia to wage the war. Russia is large enough that it has food resources to keep its population fed. This is not true for all countries on the planet, by the way, of course. As we know in the Middle East, for example, Jordan, where a country very dear to our hearts, imports like half of its foodstuff. Russia doesn't import foodstuff, it actually exports, right?
True.
And the other thing that Russia doesn't lack is energy supply. So if you have energy and food and then political will to keep waging the war, Russia can do it pretty much indefinitely. And, I would never bet against the Russian political will to wage a war. I studied history quite a bit as well. And Russians are capable of exerting efforts that are unparalleled by other, that cannot be paralleled by other peoples. And that's something we need to consider. It's not a state that, it's not a nation, it's not a collectivity that is incapable of sacrificing. And that will remain to be seen, of course, in terms of other variables that I haven't considered. For example, the domestic challenges to Putin, the internal opposition, discontent, and may or may not rise within the population. But all other things being equal, these three elements make me think that, yes, Russia could keep this effort on for a long time. So yes, we're talking about years at least. Yeah.
What do you think? Is Ukraine a vital interest for the US?
It is not.
Yeah.
Ukraine is not a vital interest for the United States. And if it were, the United States would have, look, this situation, and I'm not, and I want to preface what I'm about to say by the following. I never believe in conspiracy theories. I don't think they are a valuable way to assess our world. But when I say this is to preface the following. The United States has benefited by this conflict. Why do I say this? Not to say the United States triggered the conflict or wanted the conflict to emerge, or it spurred Ukraine or Russia to have this war, or spurred Russia to invade, none of that. But be as it may, the current situation has enhanced the position of the United States, because for decades now, since the end of Cold War, 3 decades, the United States wanted Europeans to take care of their own security, stop free riding on the American military power, and start contributing more properly into military expenditures and in containment of Russia. And the Europeans, first and foremost Germany, and second my dear country of Italy, never really access to United States request. Now they had to. Now the United States have a possibility to maintain its grip on Europe and spend fewer resources to do that. Why do I say this? Well, look at what Germany did, right? Olaf Scholz, the new Social Democrat chancellor of Germany, now vowed to spend $100 billion in rearmament plans, and to reach 2% of Germany's GDP, which is the 4th largest on the planet, for the Ministry of Defense. Which means that Europe is exiting basically the complete safety of the US umbrella when it comes to security, and taking matters more into their own hands, at the same time remaining firmly under the hegemonic sphere of influence of the United States. So the United States have accomplished what they wanted to with fewer resources, having basically the Europeans to take care more directly of their own security. But yeah, to your point, Saib, no, Ukraine is not an immediate strategic concern of the United States. Otherwise, I think, we would have seen boots on the ground already if that had been the case. But no, they think they can basically outsource.
They have a plan to put boots on the ground on the long run if this conflict spills on NATO territory?
Yeah, that's
it can spill.
It can, and I don't want to put a percentage number there, but it's double digits for sure. And I'm quite terrified by it as a fellow European. So my idea would be that if NATO countries are attacked directly or they enter the conflict directly, the United States will have at least pro forma to send a few troops down the ground, down in Eastern Europe, while at the same time trying to keep as low a profile as possible, which means that Polish troops, Romanian troops, Lithuanian, Latvian troops will be primarily the armies involved. But I don't think it is really possible for the United States to witness the entering into the military operation of fellow NATO countries and do not show anything in terms of concrete military support, in terms of boots on the ground. That would compromise the entire architecture of NATO. They have to show they're still there to take care of their allies. They'll try to do that, I guess, with as little involvement as possible of US soldiers, just because American public opinion for a few, I think I would say after, the debacle in Iraq, so at least 15 years, as we mentioned this, is not very enthralled about sending US troops abroad. It's a time that it's come and gone for a few decades.
True, especially the magnitude of this conflict is much bigger than the magnitude of Iraqi war or intervention in Afghanistan. We have lots of casualties. They didn't start counting dead, but we can say now, or at least I'm going to speak on my own, that we have tens of thousands of dead on both sides, and with the prospect of more little weaponry, the number is going to rise on both sides, or probably more on Ukrainian side, because they are inferior in terms of military equipment and military capabilities. Every now and then we can hear that Russian military leadership considers use of tactical nuclear weaponry and all kinds of sophisticated missiles. And don't forget that they didn't mobilize the population. They're fighting with professional soldiers. And from the beginning, I was very skeptical that they can control a country like Ukraine with 150,000 soldiers without so-called fifth column. So far, we didn't witness any kind of internal strife in Kiev, and 150,000, or let's say 200,000 with the army from self-proclaimed republics are not enough to occupy the whole Ukraine. They'll need at least 1 million or more to do so. And we will see in coming months what will happen. All options are open. What do you think about repercussions of this conflict on your own country, on Italy? This is for the end. This is the last question. How Italians are going to perceive this conflict?
Yeah, I'm following, as much as possible. Now, of course, I live in Morocco, so I'm not constantly daily in Italy, but I follow as much as possible news from my country. And Saib, to the point of being boring, perhaps, I look at geography and history first and foremost. Geography-wise, Italy is not threatened by Russia. It's too far. Like, Italians do not perceive Russia the way the Polish people perceive Russia, or, you know, of course, Ukrainians perceive Russia. For us, is a faraway country that has never invaded Italy, right? So we have that perception first and foremost as a country, as a people. Second, in terms of the economy, Italy used to get 40% of its gas, natural gas, from Russia, and not irrelevant amount of oil, petrol, right, and refined, gasoline products. So for the Italian economy, this war is quite bad, and the Italian economy has been bad for a couple of decades by now. So there is definitely a part of the Italian public opinion, including scholars, pundits, intellectuals, journalists, and what have you, that have an overly, positive assessment of Vladimir Putin and of his strategy, and whatever is going on in Ukraine, which leaves me quite, sad as Italian, just because one country invaded the other, and that, to me, that's the bottom line of everything. But Italy is a country that has, however, despite what I've said so far, has to maintain the relation with the United States. And the United States have expressed in no ambiguous terms what we had to do. And as a satellite of the American empire, we have to comply, which is enact strict economic sanctions, basically join the war effort with Ukraine. So we've been sending weapons as well to Ukraine, which is to say that Italy is basically, I don't want to say split, but there is the government that has to do what our patrons in Washington demands us to do, because we're part of the NATO alliance, and a non-irrelevant part of public opinion that has a favorable view of the Russian effort, or at least they justify it under all sorts of considerations. And to me, the difference is that we can explain, as you and I have tried to do today, why Russia did it, justify on a moral, ethical grounds. It's a different domain altogether, in my estimation, and I wouldn't want to.
Well, maybe we can talk about that next time.
Italy is in a tough spot. Relatively speaking, given the
yes, of course.
given the times that we live, right? We're still far away from the conflict, but.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'd love to.
And we'll discuss the Ukrainian war in coming weeks. I wish you a good day, and all the best. Nice talking to you. Bye.